Once upon a time, in the land of Bethlehem, a young widow named Ruth bent low in the fields, gathering stalks of barley beneath the golden light of the morning sun. Her fingers grazed the earth, her hands moving carefully as she picked up the fallen grain, her heart pounding with the weight of her new reality. She was a foreigner, an outsider in this land, gleaning in fields that did not belong to her, among people who spoke in hushed whispers when she passed. And yet, this was where she had chosen to be. She had left Moab behind, left behind the life she had known, the family that had raised her, the home that had once felt safe. She had left it all for Naomi, for a woman who had lost everything but still carried the weight of hope in her sorrowful eyes. And for Naomi, Ruth would do whatever it took to survive, even if it meant gathering scraps in fields that were not her own. Even if it meant being nothing more than a gleaner. The sun burned hotter as Ruth straightened, wiping the sweat from her brow, her muscles aching from hours of bending and reaching. She glanced toward the other women, the Israelite women who whispered but did not speak to her. They had grown up in Bethlehem. They belonged here. She did not. She turned back to her work, pushing away the thoughts, when suddenly a shadow fell over her. A voice, deep and steady, called out across the field, "Whose young woman is this?" Ruth's hands froze over the barley stalks, her breath catching in her throat. The workers murmured amongst themselves. Then one of the overseers stepped forward. "She is the Moabite who returned with Naomi," the man said. "She asked to glean behind the harvesters, and she has worked from morning until now, barely stopping to rest." Ruth swallowed hard, keeping her eyes low. And then footsteps, slow, deliberate. The presence beside her grew stronger until finally he spoke. "Listen to me, my daughter." She lifted her gaze, and for the first time, she saw him. The man before her was tall, strong, his features marked by years of labor and wisdom. His dark eyes studied her, not with disdain, not with judgment, but with something far different: kindness. "I do not want you to go and glean in another field," he said gently. "Stay here, close to my servant girls. Let your hands gather among them, and when you grow thirsty, drink from the water jars my men have filled." Ruth's breath shuddered. He was offering her a place, a covering, a measure of protection she had not expected. She lowered herself to the ground, bowing before him. "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you should notice me, a foreigner?" The man smiled slightly, folding his arms over his chest. "I have heard of all you have done for Naomi," he said, his voice warm. "How you left your homeland, your people, even your family, to come to a place you did not know. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." Ruth's chest tightened. She had expected whispers. She had expected coldness. She had not expected this. "You have shown me great kindness, my lord," she said softly. "I do not deserve it." The man's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, then he nodded. "Come," he said. "It is time to eat." At the midday meal, Ruth sat at the edge of the gathering, quietly eating the small portion she had brought with her. She had not expected to be included. But then Boaz called to her. "Come," he said, motioning for her to sit beside him. "Eat with us." She hesitated, then slowly stepped forward, settling onto the ground beside the other workers. Boaz handed her a piece of warm bread, nodding toward the dish of vinegar. "Dip your bread," he said. She did as he instructed, the tangy flavor of the vinegar mingling with the soft bread in a way that was surprisingly good. She ate in silence, feeling the curious gazes of the others. But Boaz did not look at her like the others did. There was no mockery in his eyes, no judgment, only something gentle and knowing. After the meal, Boaz pulled one of his men aside. "Let her glean among the sheaves," he instructed quietly. "Do not stop her. In fact, leave extra for her to gather. Make sure she is not harmed." The man nodded, but his eyes flickered with curiosity. "She is just a gleaner," he said carefully. "Why show her such favor?" Boaz exhaled, glancing toward Ruth as she returned to the fields, her hands working steadily through the barley. She was not just a gleaner. She was brave, stepping into a land that was not her own. She was loyal, refusing to abandon Naomi when she had every reason to leave. She was a woman of faith, trusting a God she had only just begun to know. Boaz could not explain it, but he knew this much. Ruth had been led to his field for a reason. And though he did not yet know what the future would hold, one thing was certain. He would protect her. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. The days passed quickly in the fields, the barley ripening beneath the heat of the sun. Ruth worked tirelessly, her hands moving over the earth, gathering the grain that had been left behind. But there was a difference now. She was not invisible anymore. The other women who had once whispered now spoke to her. The workers who had once ignored her now moved aside for her. And Boaz, he was always watching. Not in a way that made her uneasy, not in the way men had sometimes looked at her before. There was no expectation, no demand in his gaze. Only kindness, only something she did not yet have a name for. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ruth paused to drink from the water jar the men had filled. As she lifted the clay cup to her lips, a shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, and found Boaz standing there, his expression unreadable. "You've been working hard," he said. Ruth lowered the cup, wiping the sweat from her brow. "There is much to gather," she said simply. Boaz studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a patch of shade beneath a nearby tree. "Come," he said. "Rest for a little while." Ruth hesitated, glancing toward the other workers, but Boaz was not asking. He was offering, and so she followed. They sat beneath the tree, a soft breeze stirring the dust around them. Boaz stretched out his legs, resting an arm over his knee, his gaze drifting over the fields. "These lands belong to my father," he said after a moment, "and to his father before him. I have walked these fields since I was a boy." Ruth tilted her head, surprised. "Your father? He was not from Bethlehem, was he?" Boaz smiled slightly. "No. My mother was Rahab, a woman from Jericho." He glanced at her then, something knowing in his gaze. "She was a foreigner, like you." Ruth stilled. Boaz continued, his voice thoughtful. "She was not born among our people, but she chose to follow the God of Israel. She left everything behind, just as you did." Something inside Ruth tightened. She had never met another who had chosen this path, who had walked away from all they had ever known for a life uncertain. She had never imagined that Boaz, this man of standing, of wealth, of kindness, was the son of a woman who had once been an outsider too. "Was she accepted?" she asked quietly. Boaz looked at her then, really looked at her, and when he spoke, his voice was warm. "She was loved." Ruth swallowed hard. He was not just speaking of his mother. He was speaking to her. That evening, as Ruth gathered her bundle of grain and made her way home, her mind was full of Boaz, his words, his presence. The way his eyes softened when he spoke to her, the way his voice steadied when he said she was loved. She did not dare name the feeling stirring inside her chest, not yet. But it was there, quiet and undeniable, and she knew. This was only the beginning. Ruth walked the familiar path home, the weight of the grain balanced on her back, but her mind was far from the aching in her muscles. The air was cool now, the sun beginning to sink behind the hills, casting golden streaks across the rooftops of Bethlehem. She should have been thinking about the work that still lay ahead, the grain that needed threshing, the meal that needed preparing, but instead, her thoughts lingered on Boaz. The way he had spoken to her, not as a foreigner, not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. The way he had looked at her, not with pity, but with something gentler, something she could not yet name. As she stepped into the small home she shared with Naomi, she found the older woman waiting, her sharp eyes scanning Ruth's face, as if searching for something unspoken. "You are late," Naomi said, folding her arms. "Did something happen?" Ruth set the bundle of grain down carefully, brushing dust from her hands. "I was speaking with Boaz." At the mention of his name, Naomi's expression changed. "Boaz?" she repeated, her voice measured. "He spoke with you?" Ruth hesitated. "Yes, he has been kind to me." Naomi's brows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. Ruth sat beside her, untying the sack and running her fingers through the grain. "He told me about his mother," she said softly, glancing up. "He told me she was a foreigner too." Naomi stilled, her hands pausing over the fabric she had been folding. "Rahab," she murmured, almost to herself. "Yes, she was not born among us, but she chose to follow the Lord, and the Lord chose to bless her because of it." Ruth swallowed hard, her thoughts swirling. The Lord had blessed Rahab. Could he bless her too? The next morning, Ruth returned to the fields. She had expected Boaz to be busy, surrounded by his workers, overseeing the final days of the harvest. And yet, she felt his presence before she saw him. He was speaking with one of the overseers, his voice calm but firm, his posture relaxed yet commanding respect. He was a man of standing, a man who could have ignored her existence entirely. And yet when she passed by, his gaze lifted, and he saw her. Not just with his eyes, but as if she was something worth noticing, worth knowing, worth remembering. She kept her head down, her hands working swiftly, but her heart pounded louder than the sound of the sickles slicing through the barley stalks. She was a widow. She was poor. She was a Moabite. And he was a man of great wealth, a man of Israel, a man who could marry any woman in Bethlehem. And yet, something about the way he had spoken to her, something about the way he continued to offer her protection, made her wonder, could he truly care for someone like her? She shook the thought away. It was foolish. Surely Boaz's kindness was just that, kindness. Nothing more. And yet, when she glanced up again, across the field, Boaz was still watching her. And in his gaze, there was something undeniably different. Something she did not yet dare to name, but something that made her heart begin to hope. The harvest was nearing its end, and with each passing day, Ruth found herself more aware of Boaz's presence. It was not that he favored her openly, nor did he treat her differently from the others. But there was something in the way he spoke to her, gentle, steady, deliberate, as if his words carried more meaning than what was said aloud. She caught glimpses of him throughout the day, his strong hands lifting bundles of barley, his voice carrying across the field as he gave orders, his laughter ringing out among his men. She tried to ignore it. She reminded herself who she was: a foreigner, a widow, a woman with nothing to offer but her labor and her loyalty to Naomi. But even so, something inside her stirred whenever he was near. And Naomi noticed. That evening, as Ruth carefully sifted the grain she had gathered, Naomi sat across from her, watching her closely. "My daughter," Naomi said at last, her voice thoughtful, "do you know what Boaz is to us?" Ruth paused, glancing up. "He is a kind man." Naomi gave a small smile. "Yes, but more than that, he is our kinsman-redeemer." Ruth frowned slightly. "I do not understand." Naomi set down her sewing and leaned in. "In Israel, if a woman is widowed with no sons, a close relative may redeem her. He may marry her, care for her, and provide a home for her." She paused, letting the words settle. "Boaz has already shown favor toward you. Perhaps the Lord has placed you in his fields for more than just food." Ruth felt her heartbeat quicken. Boaz? Would he truly consider redeeming her? But Naomi wasn't finished. "Tonight," she said, lowering her voice, "he will be at the threshing floor, celebrating the harvest. You must go to him." Ruth's stomach tightened. "Go to him?" Naomi nodded. "After he has eaten and had his fill, he will lie down to sleep. When he does, go quietly, uncover his feet, and lie there. When he wakes, he will understand what you are asking." Ruth's throat felt dry. This was not something a proper woman did, approaching a man in the secrecy of night, making herself vulnerable before him. And yet, Naomi's eyes held something firm, something certain. "This is our custom," Naomi assured her. "Boaz is an honorable man. He will not send you away." Ruth hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she ran her fingers over the grain in her lap. Would Boaz be displeased? Would he see her boldness as foolishness? She took a slow breath, then met Naomi's gaze. "I will do as you say." The night was quiet. The stars scattered like jewels across the sky as Ruth approached the threshing floor. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, the cool night air raising goosebumps along her skin as she crept forward. Boaz lay near the grain, his cloak wrapped around him, his breathing slow and steady. The scent of barley lingered in the air, mixing with the warmth of the harvest fires burning low in the distance. Ruth hesitated. This was not just about survival anymore. This was a moment that could change everything. She knelt down carefully, her fingers trembling as she lifted the edge of his cloak, uncovering his feet. Then she lay there, waiting for him to wake, waiting for him to see her, waiting for whatever would come next. Somewhere in the night, Boaz stirred, his body shifted, his brow furrowed, and then he sat up suddenly. Startled, he looked around, his hand gripping the edge of his cloak. Then his eyes landed on her. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice husky with sleep. Ruth swallowed hard. She kept her gaze low, her voice steady but soft. "I am Ruth, your servant." She hesitated, then whispered the words Naomi had given her. "Spread your garment over me, for you are a kinsman-redeemer." Silence. Ruth could hear the sound of her own breathing, the pounding of her heart against her ribs. Would he be angry? Would he turn her away? But then Boaz exhaled slowly, his expression shifting into something softer, something deeper. "May the Lord bless you, my daughter," he murmured. "You have shown even greater kindness now than at the first, because you did not run after younger men, rich or poor." Ruth felt her chest tighten. So, he had noticed her all along. Boaz reached out, gently pulling his cloak over her, covering her just as she had asked. "Do not be afraid," he said. "I will do for you all that you ask. For everyone in this town knows that you are a woman of noble character." Ruth closed her eyes for a brief moment, relief flooding through her. But then, Boaz's voice grew serious. "There is one thing," he admitted, his brow furrowing. "There is another man, a kinsman, closer than I. He has the first right to redeem you." Ruth's stomach dropped. "Another man?" Boaz saw the worry flicker in her expression, and his voice softened again. "Rest here until morning," he said. "I will settle this matter before the elders. If he chooses to redeem you, then so be it. But if he does not—" His voice lowered, something unspoken in his tone. "Then I swear before the Lord, I will redeem you myself." Ruth's breath shook. Boaz wanted her, and if the Lord willed it, she would be his. She lay back down, covered in his cloak, but her heart was no longer steady. She was falling into something she had never expected, falling into something that, for the first time in a long time, felt like home. The first light of dawn crept over the hills of Bethlehem, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Ruth lay still for a moment, wrapped in Boaz's cloak, listening to the slow rhythm of his breath. The warmth of the garment surrounded her, a silent promise of protection, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. But reality pressed in quickly. She could not stay. The town was waking, and if she were seen leaving the threshing floor at this hour, the whispers would spread like wildfire. She could not bring shame upon Boaz or herself. Boaz stirred beside her, his voice low and gentle as he spoke. "Rise, my daughter, before anyone sees you." Ruth sat up, tucking loose strands of hair behind her ear, her heart still beating with the weight of his words from the night before. "If the other kinsman does not redeem you, I will." Would she truly belong to Boaz by the end of this day? She watched as he reached for a bundle, placing 6 measures of barley into the folds of her cloak. "Take this to Naomi," he said, his fingers lingering just slightly over hers as he handed her the grain. "You must not return to her empty-handed." Ruth swallowed, nodding, knowing that this was more than just an offering of food. It was a message, a sign that Boaz would not rest until this matter was settled. She gathered herself quickly, stepping away, but before she could leave, Boaz spoke once more, his voice lower, softer. "Wait for me." The words settled deep in her chest, an anchor in the uncertainty of the day ahead. She glanced at him one last time, his figure standing tall in the soft morning light, and then she turned toward home, carrying the grain and the hope of something more. Naomi was already waiting when Ruth stepped inside, her sharp eyes flickering between the bundle in Ruth's arms and the expression on her face. "Well?" Naomi pressed, setting down the cloth she had been sewing. "Tell me everything." Ruth took a breath, carefully placing the grain on the table before sitting across from her mother-in-law. "I went to him as you said," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I lay at his feet, and when he woke, I asked him to cover me with his cloak, to redeem me." Naomi's lips curved slightly, as if she had expected nothing less. "And?" Ruth exhaled. "He said yes." The older woman's eyes softened, relief settling into her expression. "But—" Ruth hesitated, twisting her hands in her lap. "There is another man, closer in relation. He has the right to redeem me first." Naomi's face darkened, her fingers curling tightly around the folds of her tunic. Another man. One who might claim Ruth, not out of love, but out of obligation, or worse, for the land and inheritance that came with her. Ruth searched Naomi's face, worry pressing into her chest. What if Boaz cannot redeem me? Naomi reached for Ruth's hands, gripping them firmly, reassuringly. "My daughter," she said, her voice full of certainty. "Boaz will not rest until this matter is settled." Boaz wasted no time. By mid-morning he stood at the city gate where legal matters were settled before the elders. He had always been a patient man, deliberate in his dealings, but today, he would fight for Ruth. He did not wait long before the other kinsmen arrived. "Come," Boaz called, lifting a hand. "Sit with me. We have a matter to discuss." The man approached, curiosity flickering in his eyes as he sat. Boaz gestured toward the gathering of 10 elders, a legal audience to witness the proceedings. He turned back to the kinsman, his voice steady. "You are aware that Naomi is selling the land that belonged to our relative Elimelech," Boaz began. "As the nearest relative, you have the first right to redeem it." The man nodded slowly, considering. "I will redeem it." Boaz's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "There is one more thing," he added, his tone measured. "With the land comes Ruth the Moabite, the widow of our relative. If you redeem the land, you must also take her as your wife, to continue her husband's family line." The man's expression changed immediately. The weight of the request settled between them, and Ruth's fate hung in the balance. Finally, the man shook his head. "No, I cannot redeem it. It would endanger my own estate." He lifted his hands in surrender. "Take my right for yourself." Boaz did not hesitate. The other man removed his sandal, a custom that sealed a legal transaction, and handed it to Boaz. "It is done," the man declared. The elders nodded in approval, and Boaz stood tall and sure as he spoke the words that would change everything. "You are witnesses today that I have bought from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon," he said clearly, his voice unwavering, "and I have taken Ruth the Moabite as my wife." A murmur of approval and blessing rippled through the elders and the people gathered nearby. "May the Lord make this woman like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel. May your name be renowned in Bethlehem." Boaz felt his heart settle. It was done. Ruth was his now. And as he turned away from the city gates, his mind was not on legal matters or customs or land. It was on her. On the woman who had walked into his fields, into his life, and into his heart. And now, she was his to love, forever. The late afternoon sun bathed Bethlehem in golden hues as Ruth stood in the small home she had once shared with Naomi, her hands trembling slightly as she ran them over the fabric of her cloak. Everything felt different now. Hours ago, she had been nothing more than a gleaner in Boaz's fields. Now she was his wife. The weight of those words settled deep within her chest, filling her with both joy and uncertainty. She had spent so long surviving, so long living for the next day, the next handful of grain, the next small moment of mercy. But now she had a home. She had belonging, and she had love. Boaz stood at the doorway, watching Ruth as she turned toward him, her expression unreadable. For the first time since he had spoken the words at the city gates, he saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "You do not have to be afraid," he said gently, stepping closer. Ruth swallowed, forcing a small smile. "I am not afraid," she murmured. Boaz tilted his head slightly. "No?" His voice was knowing, yet patient. Ruth let out a soft sigh, clasping her hands together. "It is just, I never imagined this for myself." Boaz nodded. "And now that it is real?" She met his gaze, searching his eyes as if trying to find her place in them. "I do not know what comes next." Boaz smiled slightly. "Then we will figure it out together." Ruth let out a quiet breath, something loosening in her chest. Here was a man who did not rush her, who did not expect her to be anything other than who she was. She had spent so much of her life being the outsider. But when Boaz looked at her, she felt seen, known, chosen. And so when he reached for her hands, she did not pull away. She held on. And for the first time in her life, Ruth let herself believe that she was home. Time passed, and Ruth's heart grew fuller than she ever thought possible. She woke each morning beside the man who had redeemed her, the man who had fought for her when she had nothing to offer in return. She walked through the fields not as a gleaner, but as a woman with a place of honor in the land. And then, one day she pressed a hand over her belly, feeling the stirrings of life inside her. Boaz looked at her in quiet wonder, his eyes full of something soft and reverent. "A son," he whispered. "We will have a son." Ruth laughed through happy tears, pressing her forehead against his. A child, a future, a legacy that would outlive them both. When Ruth placed the newborn into Naomi's arms, the older woman wept softly, cradling the child close. "My daughter," she murmured, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. "The Lord has restored what was lost." The women of Bethlehem gathered around, their voices rising in joyful song. "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without a redeemer today. May this child be a restorer of life, a joy to your old age." And there, in the warm light of her home, Ruth looked around and saw the story God had written. She had once been a widow with nothing. She had once been a foreigner with no place to belong. And yet, she had been redeemed. Not just by Boaz, but by the God of Israel, who had taken her brokenness and turned it into something beautiful. And as she watched Naomi rock the baby in her arms, Ruth understood. This love story was never just hers and Boaz's. It was a love story between her and the Lord himself, a love that had taken her from loss to restoration, from sorrow to joy, from a foreigner to one whose name would be remembered forever. Ruth and Boaz named their son Obed, and Obed would become the father of Jesse, and Jesse would become the father of David, the greatest king Israel would ever know. And from the line of David, generations later, would come the Messiah, Jesus Christ, the Redeemer of all. Because Ruth had chosen to stay, because Boaz had chosen to love, because God had written a love story greater than either of them could have imagined. And so their names were never forgotten. Their love was never forgotten, for their story, like God's love, endured forever. The end.